AWS is buying DuckLabs. The DuckLabs folks are saying that their team will remain together in Amsterdam, continuing their work on DuckDB, Duck Lake, Quack, and of course, working with the broader community. And they also go on to say later on that the open source project will pretty much stay as is, but they are going to be expanding the governance for it.
You're listening to It's About Data. In episode 90, we respond to the breaking news that AWS is acquiring DuckLabs, the developer of the DuckDB analytics database.
Okay, hot off the presses.
As of this morning when this video goes live. Right?
Oh my God, yes. Yeah. I'm not used to work. I'm not used to getting up this early. I don't know what we're going to do about this. Okay. But here we are in the dog days of summer, and suddenly this announcement crosses our desks this morning that AWS is buying DuckLabs, and according to the press release, it's expected to be effective in early September. So this is not your typical. We're going to be going through this through this due diligence period of 6 months. This is going to be happening PDQ, and one thing that's very important about this is that the DuckLabs folks are saying that their team will remain together in Amsterdam, continuing their work on DuckDB, Duck Lake, Quack, and of course, working with the broader community. And they also go on to say later on that the open source project will pretty much stay as is, but they are going to be expanding the governance for it. But anyway, this morning, basically, we're here to basically discuss this. And actually, and I'm going to kind of confess, my ignorance here, which is that I've tended to follow, the big players here. And my viewpoint has been that, well, if you look at all the database startups today, or the database startups of the past 10 years, most of them, basically have remained long tail. The last thing the world needs is another database startup, but yet you've had DuckLabs and DuckDB, or I should say more specifically DuckDB, that's really become kind of viral. And Matt, you've been a lot closer to this than I've been. So I'd like to ask you basically to kind of go through a little bit, some of the details of the announcement that kind of stood out to you.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to talk about a point of confusion here, which is there are three separate entities you're talking about. Usually, there are even more that are involved, but usually you're talking about one of three separate entities when you talk about DuckDB. So there's DuckLabs, which used to be DuckDB Labs, and this was basically a development shop founded by Mark Rasfelt and Hannes Muleisen after they started developing DuckDB. So they developed DuckDB and they're like, hey, why don't we just do this professionally, leave the university and just focus on this project. So they founded that company, DuckLabs, which is being acquired back in 2018. Then they also set up a foundation to control the open source software. So they said, hey, we're developing this, but we don't actually own the software because it's open source. And so that's where you get the DuckDB Foundation. The DuckDB Foundation, as I understand it, owns things like the trademarks, the intellectual property in the code base, and that kind of thing. And the code base itself is available under the MIT license, which means that anyone can fork it. As I understand it, MIT is permissive, which means that if I want to develop a proprietary project and keep that private from that code, I'm allowed to do that, unlike, say, Linux, where it's under GPL. Then you have another company in here, which a lot of us know in the really hot startup space, and that's MotherDuck. And so MotherDuck was founded specifically to create a cloud service around DuckDB, and that happened in 2022. And actually, Joe Reis and I interviewed the founder of MotherDuck back in 2022, who is Jordan Tigani, as this was happening. And one of the things I remember him saying on our show, he also helped to create Google BigQuery. And he said, hey, what we realized pretty quickly at Google is that for a lot of customers, BigQuery was really easy query. It was like the simplest engine you could get hold of. And so our goal with DuckDB was to make it essentially easy query as well. So the part of this that's being acquired is DuckLabs. The open source will remain an independent foundation, and MotherDuck will continue doing its own thing and using that code base as well.
Yeah. What's really interesting to me is that I see a lot of parallels with MySQL in the early aughts, 20 years ago.
Yes.
In that, what MySQL was to transaction databases is what essentially DuckLabs, I mean, at least in terms of the role it's playing, is playing in analytics. In terms of that, as I understand it, you can basically mount this thing, inside of like a Python container or something like that. You don't,
Exactly.
within your application, you don't need to mount a separate database. That's why developers loved it.
Precisely, and it was developed to be a very simple, lightweight database that, it doesn't have all the features of like a Postgres or MySQL, but like super light, low memory requirements, depending on how big you want to query and that kind of thing. And that was the big push behind this. Now, the comparison I'm going to draw here is that one of the developers of Postgres recently came out and said, hey, Oracle's acquisition of MySQL was just awesome for us because then people started running away from MySQL and coming to Postgres. Now, I believe, and you have some opinions on this too, I actually believe that Amazon's posture towards open source has really changed in the last couple of years, especially with OpenSearch. And that their intention here, we'll get more into where I think this is going for their own product space on AWS. But I think their intention here is to keep this a friendly open source project that people want to use while also pushing their own development and agenda and having DuckDB-based services available on AWS that, make money for them, obviously.
Yeah, actually, someone I would love to quote on this. He now works with Oracle, Matt Housley. Actually, he's one of your neighbors at Salt Lake. Uh, he actually, Matt has been around a number of the open source companies. And was very much involved with, as AWS basically kind of pivoted their open source strategy. But what's interesting is that historically, AWS was viewed as, was viewed as like an ogre, basically, I think the line was strip mining open source. In other words, we pay to develop it, and AWS runs a commercial service. And that battle became very fierce. With folks, not so much with Mongo, because Mongo's a very different. I never considered Mongo to be open source at the time where they claimed they were, but there was very much, that was very much the case with Elastic. And I think what's really interesting is that when Elastic, changed its business model, AWS left, and basically abandoned open source because they claimed that AWS was essentially mining all the profits from it. AWS then goes around and basically takes essentially the code that was open source from Elasticsearch, and basically launches the OpenSearch community. And what's interesting is that this was not, as it proved, as history borne out, this was not a token effort. This became a very bona fide open source project that has been adopted by many, it's become kind of the default search, open source search. That's across the industry. So it was a huge 180 for for AWS, and I think that really sets the stage. It really set the stage, I think, for Duck, for Duck, I was going to say Duck Lake, but for DuckDB and DuckLabs.
Yeah, completely agree. And I have to imagine that this had an impact. Seeing this community interaction with open source had an impact on the opinion of the founders of DuckLabs and saying, hey, we're okay selling to Amazon because we think that they'll do good things for the community in this way. And again, fundamentally, Amazon doesn't have a way of, taking away that open source project. What they could do theoretically is just steer the development efforts of the team away from, working on the public open source. But I think the founders must believe, hey, based on open source, we think Amazon is going to be a good citizen here. And yes, we'll build on their cloud platform. We're going to build some really cool stuff, but they're still going to take care of our open source community in that process.
Yeah, well, the fact is that, Amazon I don't think sees this as competitive at all. It really fills a gap in their portfolio. In terms of, if you want analytics, you have to go all the way up to to Redshift. I was going to say RedSearch, to Redshift, which is a much bigger creature, much more, it's more of an enterprise offering.
Oh, it's an MPP, right? It's a classic MPP. It's originally built on Postgres, but a lot of it is proprietary. And frankly, at this point, Redshift is probably viewed by most data engineers as being kind of clunky, like you use it if you have to stay in the AWS ecosystem. And the interesting thing here is that the DuckDB scaling model is really an alternate scaling model. You have this notion of scale up, which is, build a huge server to host a massive database. You have scale out, which means, host a lot of nodes, but all part of one database coordinated together. And that's the Redshift model. And the model here is that kind of everyone gets their own database. That's the DuckDB model.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we don't need a centralized database. Yeah, everyone can have their own. Now, the reason that MotherDuck was founded is you can see why that would be an access and security and data control nightmare, right? If you don't have a layer to say, what's our single source of truth to manage all the data in the data lake in the back end, then you're going to have massive data divergence. Now, the other recent wrinkle in this story is that agents are changing the nature of queries on databases. And so no longer do you necessarily want a huge system that all the agents query simultaneously. That's the classic MPP model, right? An enterprise buys a massive MPP and then all the analysts hit that same system. What's happening instead is that companies are exploring the idea of having agents get their own database. And that's where DuckDB comes in. And that's my suspicion that that is what Amazon wants to do. It's going to be an agentic query engine where every agent can have their own copy. And where this fits into our recent shows is Nikita Shamgunov, who's now at Databricks, but previously co-founder of Neon, said the same thing for Neon, which is a version of Postgres that's very forkable. You can create copies of it quite easily. That was what really blew up their company. Like they were, a small startup doing cool database stuff. And then overnight, they were one of the hardest data startups around because agents suddenly could build copies of their database immediately. And that's where you have, Lakebase and LTAP now in the Spark Databricks, more the Databricks ecosystem after the acquisition of Neon. And I suspect that Amazon's intention here is to make DuckDB really a great, have an agentic interface around it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely see it as essentially their answer to Lakebase.
Yeah, it seems
because the idea of these are like these small little ephemeral databases that agents may create and then take down. And I mean the whole idea is the compactness and the fact that it also that they basically they're designed along a lot of the principles for basically of CI/CD basically.
Yep. Exactly. Well, and also it's important to understand that where Neon was built on Postgres, and so, transactional database, and you're simply creating 4 copies of that, DuckDB is really based around the lakehouse concept, which means that, all your data sits on a storage layer like S3, and you have a table format managing that data, and then all these copies of DuckDB can just query it independently. And obviously, S3 is so scalable that you should never see any concurrency issue with access to data. Obviously, you can see issues with data writes, but the assumption is that these agents maybe are mostly querying and not updating data so much.
Right, but that also brings in basically when you talk about the lake house. Of course, Duck has its own its own implementation, and it's very distinct from where the rest of the industry has been going. And by that I mean, at this point, that really means Iceberg. But very different architectures. But I think also that it's the way they are doing it is very true to their design pattern, which is really more like the single use, almost like the disposable lakehouse in a way, it seems. I mean, I might be getting a little carried away there, but it's a very different, it's a very different creature from Iceberg. And in fact, it is not compatible. And
not at all,
in an era where basically the rest of the industry is going to Iceberg, this is very much the exception. And it's for a very different use case. And I'm wondering if what we're going to end up seeing is kind of a de facto sort of, and kind of splitting, splitting of the, I don't mean to say forks, the splitting of the paths, which is that you have one path, which is like the mini lake house, the mini kind of like almost the developer lake house, and the other is basically the enterprise lake house.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, if you read the Duck Lake articles, the intention there was to solve some problems that Iceberg creates. So what problems does Iceberg create? Well, to have a table format, you have to have a metadata layer, right? And traditionally, metadata layers go on a transactional database because then you can get the metadata very quickly, even if it takes a while to get the files. And so you can say, hey, show me all the tables in the schema. And that can happen, a sub-second versus querying S3, which might take you a little bit longer. And Iceberg, everything is stored in S3, which is simple, but you have this extra complexity. So with Duck Lake, what they try to do is they put all the metadata in something like a Postgres, more of a transactional database, and it also allows you to deal with transactional updates to your analytics data. Those get stored in the transactional database, and then they get compacted into files once enough time has passed. And to your point, I'll be curious to see what Amazon does with that, right? Because they may have an intention on top of what I'm projecting here, that they're going to do something with Duck Lake in terms of really making that a core component of AWS somehow. Like, I see them doing Iceberg everywhere as well, right? Amazon is not going to depart from what industry standard is,
Right.
but they might start offering Duck Lake for places where it makes sense, right?
Well, Amazon does, or I should say AWS does one of everything. So the
Yeah.
fact that they're doing Duck Lake does not mean that all of a sudden they're going to rip up their Iceberg strategy.
Absolutely not.
That they've done
Yeah.
with SageMaker.
Yeah.
This is basically a two-track. It's basically a capture of part of the market that they really were, really were missing.
Right.
And the thing, I think really what's interesting here are at this point, with and of course, post acquisition, the competitive dynamics between DuckLabs, which will be shortly part of AWS,
Yeah.
and MotherDuck, which has also made an acquisition of its own.
Yeah, so MotherDuck announced today, I believe, that they acquired a company called Tower, and they've been using Tower's services for a long time to package and manage infrastructure. And so what was happening slowly over time with MotherDuck, the original intention here was that they would, as I understand it, that when they launched in 2022, is that they would offer you DuckDB as an edge query engine. It could even run in your browser. And the idea was that you could cache data locally, run queries on that data, because a lot of queries in analytics are small, right? So be super efficient for local queries. And then when things got complicated or the data was too big or you needed to fetch more data, then you would go to the MotherDuck platform behind the scenes. And increasingly what's happened over time is that MotherDuck has turned into kind of an ETL, ELT transformation engine company and an agentic BI company. In fact, as I understand it, talking to various people, what's really blown up MotherDuck in the past year is just like agentic BI plus automating transformations and such. And so Tower, just they're bringing that infrastructure and transformation capability in-house. And that's a big deal. And so I was kind of hearing some whispers over the last year about competition between DuckLabs and MotherDuck, but I feel like their paths are diverging enough that they'll actually be more collaborative in the future. And especially, I don't think it's AWS's intention right now, we'll see, to directly compete head on with MotherDuck. I think they have different intentions, but we'll see how that goes.
I'll take a little bit of issue there in terms of, I don't think collaborative will necessarily be the word, term to describe it, the optimal term. What I do see is that their paths are divergent, and that, of course, AWS is especially the EC2 side of the house is really at a co-opetition, which is that AWS may have their own document database, which I think is still called DocumentDB. I'm not sure, because I know Microsoft has something with the same name, or had something with the same name. It is DocumentDB, but at the same time, they have a strategic alliance with Mongo. They are Mongo's largest. I don't know if I'd call it reseller, but they're Mongo's largest channel. So AWS has a huge history, and so I wouldn't be surprised that, of course, MotherDuck, being the cloud service of DuckDB, will continue to basically have its share on AWS. But I want to get back a little bit in terms of the competitive dynamics here, because looking at the open source project, the DuckDB Foundation, now I know that basically as a result of this, they are expanding the governance board, but looking at the history at this point, who's been most of the contributors? Has it been primarily DuckLabs?
As far as I know, it's almost all DuckLabs. Now, in many cases, that meant that if you wanted a customization, say you're a big DuckDB user, and you wanted a customization of some sort, like add some code to the core base to expand features, you would contract with DuckLabs. And so presumably a lot of that business is no longer going to be there. And so then the question is, who's controlling the commits? Are basically the DuckLabs people kind of going to step away from the core code base and say, hey, we're going to work on our stuff for Amazon. We'll contribute it, but we're going to let someone else take care of the commits so that you can take in other pull requests and things. That remains the question. Right now, anyone can now fork the code base and create their own version of
Hmm.
DuckDB, but you can't call it DuckDB, right? You don't control that.
Right.
You can't use that trademark. And so, yeah, the control of that core code base and the name and everything else through the foundation, that will be an interesting question. That's not owned by Amazon. But if you're familiar with astronomer.io, for example, which was in the news recently for all the wrong reasons, what they
Hmm.
did with Apache Airflow is they decided, hey, we're pivoting into being a company that supports and builds Apache Airflow. And so they just hired all the committers to it and
Right.
effectively got control of the project that way. And so in a sense, it's like, okay, is Amazon going to try to fully control this code base? Are they going to hand off the community efforts to someone else and just, pass their commits over to the community? That part is unclear to me.
It's a good question there,
Yeah.
and the fact is that if you look at OpenSearch, basically, um, that actually has remained pretty much a community
It
project.
really has. And Amazon, again, I'm not involved, but it sounds like they've done a great job of collaborating with the community on that.
Yeah, I don't think that's really the prime, the prime objective for AWS. It might be that de facto that the Duck Labs folks still retain effective control through their. I mean that may happen, but I don't see that as being a conscious strategy on AWS's part.
Yeah.
I think on the part of MotherDuck, even before all this happened, the fact that they were starting to diversify their business away from just being
Mm-hmm.
the cloud version of DuckDB is that we just have to learn from the history of Hadoop, where essentially it just didn't make sense for you to have Cloudera and Hortonworks. It didn't make sense to have two different companies.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, completely
and
agree with that.
on what it was essentially, for as much hype as it got, and I'm one of those responsible for the hype. It was a niche project, and for all its virality, for the fact that it's gone so viral, the fact is, DuckDB is still pretty much a niche database. I don't see it having the same type of universal, popularity that MySQL had in it, during its heyday. That being said, though, there is a huge launch pad for growth now that they're on the, now that they're part of the AWS family in terms of just from a standpoint of that, it fills a gap in the AWS database portfolio,
Yeah.
and therefore gives basically you know the Duck Labs folks more feet on the street to basically build market. I think what'll be interesting to see who are the partners basically that the partnerships that MotherDuck basically develops at this point, and whether one
Exactly.
of the other hyperscalers might take a strategic interest in MotherDuck.
Yeah. Yeah. Precisely. I mean, yeah, MotherDuck is probably going to be an acquisition target now, too, at
Yeah,
this
yeah.
point, right? And again, so much of the interest is going to be, as I mentioned, agentic querying. If DuckDB kind of becomes the de facto standard outside of Databricks for agentic querying, then maybe it could become sort of the Postgres of the analytics world, where it's just everywhere that you could possibly look these days.
Oh golly, let's get back to summer at this point. I'm so
Yeah,
sick
yeah.
of the news.
Okay.
I mean, the dead of summer, we're just saying like we have a few more days. Give us a few more days off.
Right, right. I mean, but
Gotcha.
that's the nature of the this whole tech scene right now, right? Deals
Yes.
happen very, very fast. You don't sit on them till conference season because you're worried about someone else swooping in. So you announce it, you start the regulatory approval process, and you want to get it done as quickly as possible.
And somehow I don't see this one having to jump through a huge number of regulatory hoops.
Yeah, probably not, unless there's a lot of scrutiny because Amazon is getting bigger. They're not acquiring a huge player, so they can probably get away with this.
Right. I was trying to think of like a metaphor of basically a pond and puddle jumping, but my mind is failing me now, which I think means it's time to pull the plug on this. But anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
Well, well. Thanks for taking the time here, basically on short notice.
Yeah, and if you see this right after it comes out, it should come out around the time that the press release drops and the embargo lifts on this information.
Which
So we were
means you're pulling
privileged.
it. Which means, dude, you're pulling an all-nighter.
Well, hopefully not.
Somebody's got to do the work here. It's no good job. Somebody's got to do it. Anyway, talk to you later.
Take care.